Now that you know a bit about let and const, there is one more ES6 feature I want to talk about, and that is the arrow function. It is by far my favorite ES6 feature, and I have no idea how we ever lived without it. It is a brand new syntax for creating functions, and we're going to explore exactly what's so great about it. Now to do that, we're going to make a brand new file in the playground folder. Once again, we can call this ES6 arrow function, and we're going to be using arrow functions heavily throughout the course, so it's going to be a good idea to get a basic grasp of how they work over here, and then we'll be integrating them into our React application. Now, to kick things off, we are going to run this file through Babel as opposed to app.js. Like we did in the last video, we can do that by switching over to the terminal, shutting down the command, loading it up again with the up arrow key, and then just adjusting that very first argument. In this case, it is source app.js. We want to go into that playground folder, and in there we have es6-arrow-function.js. That's the file that we just created. So once this is up and running, back inside of the browser, we're going to see that the application is indeed working. It just has no content, so nothing shows up. Let's get some stuff showing up to the screen by going through a simple example. We're going to create a function that squares a number. So the function will take a single argument, a number, and it'll return that number times itself. We're going to do this first using tools we already know, ES5 functions. Then we're going to convert it over to an arrow function so we can compare and contrast the two solutions. So let's kick things off. I'm going to make a const. I can call this one square. And we're going to set it equal to a function. I'll use the function keyword. I'll define my arguments list and my function body. Nothing new here. And we're going to have a single argument, x, and we're just going to return x times itself. Return x times x. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and call this. There's no need to store the return result in a variable. We're just going to be dumping it to the screen. So we can set all of this up inside of console.log. Inside of the arguments list for console.log, we want to print out the return result from calling square, and we'll pass in a value to square. I'll start with 8. 8 times 8 is 64. If I save the file, it's exactly what we should get, and right here we are indeed getting 64 printing to the screen. So we've gone through the process of creating an ES5 function. Let's go ahead and see how the ES6 arrow function will look a little bit different. Now that we have our working ES5 function, let's create the exact same function using ES6 arrow functions. We're going to start off much the same way. We are going to define a variable, a constant in this case, and we're going to give it a name. Square is already taken, so I'll use square arrow. Then we're going to set it equal to something. Now so far, nothing new. This is where we start to define the arrow function. And the first thing you're going to notice is that the function keyword has gone away. So no longer are we going to type function. We're actually going to start with the arguments list. Just like we have up above, we're going to open and close some parentheses. In here, we would define all of the arguments our function takes. If it takes none, it'll look like this. If it takes 3, A, B, and C, it'll look like that. In our case, we just have one, X. Now from here, we put the arrow in arrow function. Right after a space, I'm going to create that arrow using equals and greater than. This is our arrow. Then after the arrow, we can go ahead and set up that function body. And there we have it. We now have an arrow function. Currently, it doesn't do anything, but we could put anything we want inside of it. I could call other functions. I could create variables and run calculations. In our case, we just want to return x times x. Return, nothing's new there. X times x, nothing's new there either. So now let's go ahead and actually use this and make sure it's working. Right here, I'm going to call square arrow instead of square. I'm going to save the file, and there we go, 64 prints. If I switch this over to 9, we should get 81, and there we go, we are indeed getting 81. It's also important to note that ES6 arrow functions, they are always anonymous. So with an ES5 function, we can actually name it, which means that right here, I could type a function name, we'll call it square, and I could remove the need for this constant altogether. I can then reference it by its name. I'm going to add another console.log call, console.log. I'm going to call square once again, and I'll square a number like 3. If I save the file, everything still works. With arrow functions, there is no way to define a named arrow function like we can with an ES5 function. All arrow functions are anonymous, so there's no place we could put square arrow. You can't put it here, you can't put it in here, and you can't put it here. If you want to create an arrow function and reference it later, you have to assign it to a variable exactly like what we have right here. Now at this point, we've only explored the syntax differences and there doesn't seem to be a clear advantage, so I don't expect any oohs or ahs just yet. But what we're going to do now is explore one of the great things about arrow functions, which is the arrow function expression syntax. It allows us to create much more concise functions under certain situations. So down below, what we're going to do is we're going to recreate square arrow using this arrow function expression syntax. This is a great candidate because what we have is a function, and that function just returns some expression. The expression could be another function call. It could be a math operator like we have here. Maybe we call some method on an array or a string. As long as we just have a single expression whose value we're returning, we can actually switch this over to using the new concise syntax. Now I'm going to comment out this function since we want to reuse that name. I'm going to comment it out. And down below, we can go ahead and actually create the new one. Const square arrow. Things are going to start off exactly the same. Then we're going to set it equal to, once again, the same. And now we move on to the arrow function part. The arguments list looks identical. We are going to provide our one argument. Maybe we have 0, maybe we have 6. Then we move on to the arrow that is the same as well. We're going to set up the equal sign and the greater than symbol, but this is where things differ. When we're working with an arrow function and we define the verbose version with a body, we have all of the statements inside. But remember, if it's an arrow function and it only returns a single expression, you can switch it to this new syntax. And the new syntax requires you to put that expression right here. That is x times x, and there we have it. Now we have a much more concise version of square arrow. If I go ahead and I save the file, we're going to get 81. If I tweak this to a different value like 4, we're going to get 16. So when we're working with the arrow function expression syntax, we do not explicitly use return anywhere. Instead, this expression is implicitly returned. So these two are identical. They both do the exact same thing. In the end of the day, it is just a difference in how they're set up. Now, clearly, we can't use the expression syntax in every situation. If we had to make other function calls, if we had to wait on promises, or do anything like that, we might want to break it out into a full function with a function body. But in this case, we have a great candidate, and we were able to switch it over. Now, at first, switching from ES5 functions to arrow functions is going to be a real big burden. Code you read that uses arrow functions is going to be a whole lot harder to read, and writing code using it is going to be harder as well, but that's only going to last for about 2 weeks. Once you get a little more experience using them, you're really going to start to see the advantages, and you're going to wonder how you ever used ES5 functions. Now it's challenge time. I'm going to go ahead and comment out everything we wrote so far so the output in the console isn't too distracting. We're going to keep that nice and clean, and we can outline the challenge down below. So your challenge is to use arrow functions. You're going to use arrow functions for all of the functions we create. No need to use ES5 functions for this challenge. The whole goal is to use this new tool. Now the function you're going to be creating is going to be called getFirstName, and we're going to use the exact same logic we used over here inside of the ES6 letConst file. We had a full name. This time you're going to take it in as an argument, and we have the logic for extracting the first name, and that's what you're going to be returning. So you're going to grab that argument, you're going to split it based off of the space, that returns an array with the parts, and you're going to grab that first part. This is going to be the return value from the arrow function. So if I were to call getFirstName with the string Mike Smith, I would expect the value that prints to the console to be Mike. So let's go ahead and outline exactly what I'd like you to do. First up, you're going to create an arrow function using the verbose syntax. So create regular arrow function. You're going to go ahead and use this and test it, making sure it works. Then you're going to create a second arrow function using the expression syntax. So you're going to create arrow function using the shorthand syntax. Both functions are going to do the same thing like we have here. They're both just going to use the different version of the arrow function. Now, like with the first version, you want to go ahead and test this and make sure it works. You can always just call it inside of a console.log to dump it to the screen. There's no need to store the return result in a variable or do anything like that. You can use the exact same techniques we used right here. So take some time to knock this one out. You want to create those two functions and test them, making sure they work. And if you forget how to use that logic, you can always grab it from this file. Test your work, pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get it done without too much trouble. I'm going to start by creating the regular old arrow function, not using that shorthand syntax right here. A const get first name. It is going to have an argument, so we're going to open and close those parentheses and define it. We can call it anything we like. I'll call it full name. And then we're going to go ahead and set up the arrow in arrow function, and we're going to start with the regular version first, where we do define that function body. Now inside of here, we can return our expression, which is full name dot split, splitting on that space that returns the array, and we are going to access the first part that is going to successfully return the first name. Right here, we can go ahead and test that out by calling it console.log. I am going to call get first name, and we'll pass in a name. I'm going to use Mike Smith, the example from the comments above. We can save the file, run the program, and hopefully Mike prints, and that is exactly what we get. So there we go. We knocked out the first version of our arrow function. Now it's time to create a new version using the shorthand syntax. You might have created a second variable with a new name. That's fine. You might have also commented out the old function and just defined the new one using the same name. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Right here, we're going to once again make that const get first name. Then we're going to move on to the arrow function. We are going to define that arguments list full name, and we do still need to put the arrow in arrow function. Right here, we'll set up that arrow. Now we're using the new expression syntax, and we know we don't use return. The value is implicitly returned as opposed to explicitly returned. No need to define a return. Also no need for those curly braces. So right here, we just add our expression. That's full name dot split. Splitting on that space that returns the array. We don't want to return the array. We want to return the first item in the array. So we grab that using the 0 index. Now we can go ahead and save that file, test things out. Mike still prints. I'm going to switch this over to my name, Andrew Mead. I save it, and right there we get Andrew. So at this point, everything is working as expected. We've successfully created get first name using the arrow function expression syntax. That is it for this first video on arrow functions. We explored the syntax, the basics. In the next video, we're going to dive into some of the nitty-gritty, exploring how it really does work for us. Then we're going to go ahead and get back to React. I'm very excited to get to it, so stay tuned. I will see you in the next video.